Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is your host, PA, and today we're going to get into the Hegelian philosophy in education and the psychology that was brought into the schools and started in the schools with the help of the formed foundations and the Tavistock controllers. So here they're stating that one of the major world arenas in which Hegelian philosophy and the materialistic anti-psychology of one has been applied to education. In 1819 in Prussia, the first compulsory schooling for children was initiated and instituted. According to the educator John Taylor Gatto, the society in Prussia was divided into these three classes. One, children who will become policy makers, again, politicians. Then the children who will become the assistants to the policymakers, which would be the engineers, the architects, the lawyers, and the doctors. And then there would be the other vast of children. Now, Prussia sets up a three-tier school system in which 1/2 of the population in that school system is taught how to think. So that would be your supposed political class. So the way they set up these schools is you have your political class, meaning the people that are going to do the bidding of the globalists and the ruling class, like the Rockefellers and the bankers. And then you had the second level or the second degree. And the first level would go to school, which would be called academia or academies. And then you have the second group, which would be 5.5% of the population will go to something called the real schooling, where they partially learn things, so they don't fully become experts in anything. Because Prussia believed that the elitists from Prussia believed that their defeat at the hands of Napoleon was caused by the people thinking too much. They were thinking for themselves, and that was an issue. They were thinking for themselves at times of stress on battlefields. They didn't want that. They wanted a robotic, dumbed down populace that would do and obey as their masters tell them. So they were going to see to it that scientifically they would never get these types of masses again. And they would use psychologists to prevent the population from thinking for themselves. So the lowest of the 94%, which would be the lower half of the pyramid. So you have the upper half, the politicians, the upper to middle class or upper to middle levels would be the doctors, the engineers, the experts. And then you had the 94% of the lower class, or the rest of the 94% would be the dumbed down common man or the peasant. So the lowest 94%, that's, part of the bottom, the rest of the pyramid, would go to something called the Volksschooling. This is where they would learn to learn harmony, to learn obedience, to learn to have freedom from stressful thinking, and to follow orders. They worked out a system that would in fact guarantee such results. In the Volksschooling, it was to divide whole ideas, which really simultaneously participated in math, science, social thinking, language, and the arts. And they were divided into subjects, which hardly had existed before. So they divided the subjects further into units. Again, this is why our school system is the way it is. You have in junior high and high school, you have maybe 30 minutes to 45 minutes of each subject. So the purpose of this would be to keep everyone from learning a portion and never becoming experts in anything. That's the whole purpose of our school system. And they spread this around the world. So you would learn the basics. They would break everything into small classes or units. And then they would divide the time into small enough units of the time with enough variations in the course of the day so no student would know what was going on. In the middle of the last century, a member of the secret society Skull and Bones was following in the footsteps of the Prussian tradition and put in motion and put it into motion in an American educational revolution that has subverted the entire American system towards the goals of the New World Order. That man was Daniel Coit Gilman. He was the first president of Johns Hopkins University and the Carnegie Institute. Gilman studied the Hegelian philosophy at the University of Berlin. He studied at the University of Berlin in 1854 and 1855. He also studied at the he also was at the University of Berlin during this time during the time of William Wundt, who was the key in applying the Hegelian-styled psychology to the world. Gilman came from a family of bonesmen, and after he returned from Germany in 1856, he became treasurer of the Skulls and Bones Society. Simultaneously, Gilman became assistant librarian at Yale and was appointed to the position of head librarian 2 years later. During the same period, Skulls and Bones Society covertly took over the administration of Yale University, with the presidency of the school from that period forward, which turned over to a succession of the quote-unquote Illuminized bonesmen. So basically, the Skulls and Bones came into the school, the members, and they took the administration over. According to the Iconoclast of October 13th, 1873, it was quoted as saying, "They have obtained control of Yale." They were talking about the Skulls and Bones members. "They have obtained the control of Yale. Its business is performed by them. The money paid to the college must pass into their hands and be subjected to their will. No doubt they are worthy men in themselves. But the many whom they looked down upon while in college, or excuse me, but to the many who they looked down upon while in college, cannot so far forget as to give money freely into their hands. Men in Wall Street complain that the college comes straight to them for help, instead of asking each graduate for his share. The reason is found in the remark made by one of Yale's and America's first men. And this is what he stated: "Few will give but bones men, and they care for more of their society," meaning their secret society, "than they care due for the college. The Wolseley Fund has but a struggling existence for kindred reasons. Here then appears the true reason for Yale's poverty. She is controlled by a few men who shut themselves off from others and assume to be their superiors." Gilman met with Friedrich T. Gates, who ran the Rockefeller's foundations, and he implored Gates to set up the Southern Educational Board, which merging the Slater and the Peabody funds. Gilman called the foundation of General Education Board, signaling his intentions. The organization was later renamed the Rockefeller Foundation. Gilman was the first president of Johns Hopkins University, and he carefully chose for the faculty members. He chose all Skulls and Bones and other secret society groups of the Hegelian stripe. Among those was G. Stanley Hall, which was the first of once American students to make a mark. Hall's training in Leipzig was paid for by a loan from the member of the Skull and Key Sister Society, and this is the sister society for the Skulls and Bones at Yale. In Leipzig, Hall immersed himself in the Hegelian-inspired psychological studies, which was taught by materialist psychologists like Hartmann, Helmholtz, and his greatest influence, Wundt. Returning to America in 1883, he took over the psychological laboratory at the new Hopkins University, or John Hopkins, and started the American Psychological Association and the American Journal of Psychology. This is why I'm pausing here. This is why many of us don't trust any of these philanthropy institutions, any of the universities, or any association that our politicians have given so much power to, like the psychological or the American Psychological Association and the American Journal of Psychology. You can't trust it because it's coming out of the secret societies themselves. And they themselves say that they've altered education so they can bring the tiered system of NPCs basically to do their bidding for the New World Order. So the psychology I taught, and this is what Hall says about his teachings at the John Hopkins. He states, the psychology I taught was almost entirely experimental, and it covered, for the most part, the material that Wundt had set forth in the later and larger edition of the Physiological Psychology. In 1889, Hall was chosen as the first president of the newly established Clark University in Massachusetts. Hall was a mentor of one of the most influential names in American education in this century, and that was John Dewey. Dewey studied under Hall at Johns Hopkins, moving on to teach at the University of Michigan and the University of Minnesota. Another major influence upon Dewey was the Hegelian philosopher George Sylvester Morris. He had received his doctorate from the University of Berlin. According to Dewey, echoing the sentiments of his Prussian mentors, this is what he stated: there is no God, and there is no soul. There are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, the immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes. Dewey published the first American textbooks on Hegelian philosophy as applied to with the Wundtian psychological innovation in his book of psychology. In 1895, he joined the faculty of Rockefeller-funded University of Chicago and headed the philosophy, psychology, and teaching departments, and established an education laboratory called the Dewey School, later known as the Laboratory School of the University of Chicago. Dewey followed the Wundtian example in his insistence that education was not the teaching of mental skills, such as reading and writing, but that in the channeling of raw experiences to the evolving mind of a child, a sort of psychic Skinner box version of education. The traditional role of the teacher as the educator was replaced by the teacher as the shrink, and as the socializer, and as the eugenicist. and herald of the coming world superstate. So let me repeat that again about Dewey. Dewey saw teachers not as educators, but as therapists and psychologists and as socializers. So people that engineer and as eugenicists. And he saw this in terms of what he was expecting, the New World Order, which was the world superstate that was coming. Dewey believed that the purpose of the public schools was to, quote, take an active part in determining the social order of the future, according as the teachers aligned themselves with the newer forces which were making for social control of the economic forces. Dewey also remarked that, quote, the school is primarily a social institution, education being a social process. The school is simply that form of community life in which all those agencies are concentrated and that will be most effective in bringing the child to share in the inherited resources of the race and to use his own power for social ends. Education, therefore, is a process of living, not of preparation for the future living. For Dewey, sorry about that. For Dewey, the issue was always how the child related to the state, not rather how the state would relate to the child. Another student of one who was to prove to be perhaps the most successful popularizer of the new psychology that abolished the psyche was James McKeen Cattell. Cattell was once assistant in Leipzig in the years 1883 and through 1886. He received his PhD from the grand old man in 1886. Lecturing in Cambridge in 1887, Cattell met and was converted to social Darwinism by Darwin's cousin, the English psychologist Francis Galton. This is the man responsible for popularizing, at the beginning of this century, the science of eugenics and the selective breeding. In 1887, Cattell established a mold. In 1887, Cattell established at the University of Pennsylvania a psychological laboratory of the Wundtian mold. Then moved on in 1881 to head the new psychology department at Columbia University. Cattell was tremendously influential in disseminating the new overtly materialistic psychology and did so by establishing a host of magazines. These are the likes including the Psychology Review or the Psychological Review, Science, the Scientific Monthly, and the School and Society. He also published reference works, including the American Men of Science, Leaders in Education, and the Directory of American Scholars. An effective strategy for screwing Wundtian school psychologists into the mainstream of American thought. Another of Cattell's questionable feats was the abolishing of the use of phonics, the phonics methods for teaching and reading. Cattell popularized the Luxe method, a technique that, according to some sources, had been invented by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, and this was to teach the deaf. Although Gallaudet was not a member of the Skulls and Bones, two of his sons attended Yale and were initiated into the secret society. This was following upon the insight of Gallaudet in teaching the deaf. Cattell came up with a conclusion that the direct memorization of words would increase literacy if applied to normal students. Experience in subsequent years has not proven this to be the case. One byproduct of Catel's advocacy of the Luxe theory is that as we approach the 21st century, millions of American adults cannot read or write at all. The whole story about Gallaudet may in fact be a sanitization of what actually happened. Educator Taylor Gatto attributes the Luxe method to the Prussian system of schooling, where this system of not teaching reading was used essentially to disadvantage all but the privileged class. Gatto says, quote, so they figured out that by replacing the alphabet system of teaching reading, we teach sounds. The Prussian system was a whole sentence system rather than a whole word system. You memorize the sentences. If they could get the kids and keep them from reading or reading well for the first 6 to 7 years, then it didn't really matter after that. They had broken the link between printed information, possibly the most effective Trojan horse for injecting the Wundtian theory of man as a machine into the American educational establishment. James Earl Russell, who studied under and received his doctorate from Wundt in 1894. Russell became dean of the New York College, and this is the New York College for Training of Teachers, which he would run for 30 years while he heavily weighted the faculty with practitioners of Wundtian school. At the time, turning it into the largest institution for training of teachers in the country. Another luminary in the shrink wrapping of American education was Edward Lee Thorndike. Thorndike, who studied with Wundtian's Armstrong and Judd at the Wesleyan University, graduating in 1895. Thorndike moved on to Columbia University, where he specialized in studying animals in the puzzle box mazes, finally finding his niche at Teachers College under Russell. According to Thorndike, teaching, quote, was the art of giving and withholding stimuli, with the result of producing or preventing certain responses. In this definition, the term stimulus is used widely for any event which influences a person. For a word spoken to him, a look, a sentence which he reads, the air he breathes, etc. The term response is used for any reaction made by him. A new thought, a feeling of interest, a bodily act, any mental or bodily condition that was resulting from the stimulus. The aim of the teacher is to produce a desirable and prevent an undesirable change. Let me repeat that again. The aim of the teacher is to produce desirable and prevent the undesirable changes in human beings. And this is done by producing and preventing certain responses. The means at the disposal of the teacher are the stimuli, which can be brought to bear upon the pupils. The teacher's words, the teacher's gestures, the teacher's appearance, the teacher's condition, and the appliances of the schoolroom, the books to be used, the objects to be seen, and so on, through a long list of things and events which the teacher can control. Thorndike further stated, quote, studies of the capacities and the interest of the young children indicate the advisability of placing the little emphasis before age of 6 upon either the acquisition of those intellectual resources known as the formal tools, which is reading, spelling, arithmetic, writing, or upon abstract intellectual analysis. Despite rapid progress in the right direction, the program of the average elementary school is too narrow and academic character. Traditionally, the elementary school has been primarily devoted to teaching the fundamental subjects, which are the 3 R's. and closely related disciplines, which are artificial exercise, like drills on phonetics, multiplication tables, and formal writing movements. These are used to a wasteful degree. Subjects such as arithmetic, language, and history include content that is intrinsically of little value. Nearly every subject is enlarged unwisely to satisfy the academic ideal of thoroughness. That's the typical school of overemphasizes instruction. And this is the instruction in these formal academic skills as a means of fostering intellectual resources. Elimination of the unessentials by scientific study then is one step in improving the curriculum. The emphasis by Thorndike and his fellows on the quote unquote socialization of the student, in fact, is subjugation of the student. And this is subjugation of the student to the social order, as opposed to the teaching of specific skills. This is another factor that has led to a general breakdown of the literacy in the United States, while at the same time providing no noticeable increase in the ability of them to socialize. In fact, it is obviously the contrary. Thorndike believed that quote unquote education is interested primarily in the general interrelation of man and his environment, and all the changes which make possible a better adjustment of a human nature to its surroundings. This is another important aspect of Thorndike's and all of the latter Wundtian philosophies. Man is an animal who must adapt to the environment, that is, the social system and the political regime, rather than adapting the environment to his own vision. Man is to be conditioned to accept the circumstances that he finds himself in, not to learn to change them. Again, this is the controlling factor of the elite, and the elite have no qualms about changing society or the environment to conform to their whims, even if it takes dosing a rainforest. It is only the rebellious public schooled who must have the devastating defect of individuality brainwashed out of them. The socialization techniques used by the Wundtians create robots, not sociable people. Working out of the Teachers College of Columbia University and the latter established Lincoln School, and the dependent upon a steady infusion of Rockefeller money, the major lights in the field of Wundtian psychology, including Thorndike, Cattell, Russell, and Dewey, kick-started the quote-unquote educational psychology, which is remaking and has remade the face of American schools. And many of these disciples of Wundt were very straightforward in proclaiming the real purpose of the educational psychology. The real purpose was the creation of the New World Order. This is why so I'm pausing here. This is why we see our school systems the way that it is. How we're being taught the subjects and how they're injecting activism, critical race theory, and before that, the white supremacy genetics theory in the early 1900s through 1970s. Genetics was acceptable in the school system. Learning about, the different races was acceptable. That some were inferior and some were superior. So by the 1950s, the Teachers College was indisputably the most powerful force in education in America, with approximately 1/3 of the school's presidents and deans and 1/4 of all American teachers accredited there. It must have been reassuring to the Rockefellers and their ilk to see that the materialistic psychology and education had won and was now being accepted as the norm in American school systems. So we'll continue this tomorrow. Um, Make sure you like, subscribe, share, hit all notification for future live streams and videos. If you want to support monetarily, you can support me at the links in the description.